Our last talk before we have concluding comments, if there are any, is by Willet Boyer from the Aucilla River Institute. The Aucilla River as boundary and interaction zone in the early contact and colonial periods.
Now, let's take a look here at the talk I'm giving on the river of Ivitachuco. We're taking a look at the Aucilla River, and we've had a lot of discussion in the talks so far about natural resources. We've had some really excellent talks or conversations about some of the aspects of the environment here in the Big Bend around the Aucilla River. One thing that most people kind of take for granted, assuming, but I think it's worth mentioning, is that there's only one place where the Aucilla looks like it does in this slide up here, where you've actually got a noticeable river channel. Up on the north end of the river and down on the south end of the river, because of the karst environment, you've got the river going up and down. You have areas that may look like ponds or stretches where there's just water on the surface. You've got land bridges. And that essentially means that there are certain areas where you can cross easily. When Narvaez's got it this way, he doesn't mention crossing a river when he comes into this particular territory, and I've always thought that means it's likely. Again, this is kind of support for Jim's hypothesis of things going there close, but he seems to have stuck closer to the coast. And DeSoto is the only one who mentions crossing as a river, as we'll talk about here in just a little bit. Now, at the time of the earliest encounters of European explorers in this area, you've got the Aucilla representing a boundary. It is the boundary between the Timucuan-speaking cultures on the eastern side and the Apalachee on the west. The Aucilla basically continues as a geographical boundary after that. When you have Spanish colonization and missionization, you have the boundary between what was called Timucua proper, which starts on the west side of the Aucilla River and goes east for a substantial distance, and then on the west side you've got the province of Apalachee. Later than that, of course, during the British period, the Aucilla is the dividing line between East and West Florida. Now, the thing about the Aucilla is that it's not just a boundary. Because of the land bridges and also because of the fact that the river rises and falls during the year, you have also an interaction zone. You've got the place where people east and west of the river are coming together, they're meeting. And what I want to talk about or focus on in this final talk is two cultures that are associated with the Aucilla in particular, and that is the chiefdoms of Asile and Ivitachuco. Asile is Timucuan. It is located on the eastern side of the Aucilla River, and as an aside, it's what gives the Aucilla its modern name. The Timucuan word Asileco means the withered leaf, and Asile is a part of that name, and it's what is corrupted eventually over time into the name Aucilla. Now, Ivitachuco has already been mentioned yesterday by Rochelle Marinan, talked at by a couple of other speakers. Ivitachuco is in the early contact and a big chunk of the colonial periods, arguably the most powerful or one of the most powerful of the chiefdoms of the Apalachee. And it seems to be located, based on a number of pieces of evidence that we're going to discuss here in a bit, on the western side of the Aucilla River in the vicinity of modern-day Lamont. In the early contact and colonial periods, the chief of Ivitachuco is a big player in the events that are taking place, particularly after Spanish colonization. Now, what I want to do in talking about these two cultures is to discuss a little bit about what the Aucilla Research Institute has done these last few years in terms of archaeological work or survey. Jim's extraordinary work, Andy's, others on the Aucilla River has meant that the Aucilla River is well known to folks that do studies of Paleo-Indian sites. The thing is that it is equally important in the colonial period, it is equally important in the early contact period, but for a number of different reasons, the sites there immediately by the river haven't had the degree of study or depth that Jim, that Andy, and others who have specialized in that area have given to the paleo sites. And we're just beginning, hopefully, to make some changes in that. What I want to discuss in this paper is the relationship between the people of Asile, the people of Ivitachuco, their relationship to the Aucilla River. I want to talk a little bit about the archaeological evidence. As we're going to see, one of the things that's intriguing about what has turned up in our studies so far is that while these groups are both in close proximity to the Aucilla River, the way that they use this region's resources, the way they use the river's resources is radically different, at least based on the archaeological evidence we've uncovered so far. So what I want to do is present what we know about the archaeological evidence of both groups, and then from there try to draw out some conclusions and hopefully some avenues for future research. So we'll take a look at what we've got here. These two groups, Asile and Ivitachuco, are the first, among the very first Native American groups that are encountered in the early contact period. You have with DeSoto, comes ashore 1539. This is the projected route based on the archaeological evidence, the very limited archaeological evidence, I hasten to add. There's still a lot of controversy about where most DeSoto sites are located. But he seems to come ashore in Tampa Bay. He comes north through the center part of Florida, passes through the area north of modern-day Gainesville, and then begins to make a turn to the west. Now, in Jim's talk, he mentioned the area of Dead Man's Bay. It's somewhere in that area to the north that you have, Narvaez referred to a chief called Dulcinchellan. The same chief is referred to by DeSoto as Uzachile. And DeSoto encounters this chief. He leaves that area, the chiefdom, the larger chiefdom of Ustega, and he goes west. First night he spends, the Spanish account literally translates as a pine woods or a pine forest. I was thinking of that when we were listening to some of the earlier talks today. And in the very end of September, 1539, you've got Soto himself with an advance group of 150 men, 50 on horseback, 100 on foot, that come to the town of Asile, which he refers to as located on the river of Ivitachuco. So the Apalachee have given their name to this river, and he is staying there. He spends the night there, first day of October 1539. He and his men move forward. They move into what's described as the swamp or canebrake that surrounds part of the river of Ivitachuco. They build a bridge. They cross the river of Ivitachuco, and they are attacked immediately by the Apalachee from what is described as a canebrake. That area still has river cane and great abundance, particularly there on the western side of the Aucilla. And you can imagine, if you work in that area or walk through that area, what it would have been like for the Spaniards crossing on this bridge they've made. They fight their way out of the ambush. The Apalachee retreat a bit, and they travel for most of that day, and they come to the town of Ivitachuco, and the Spanish accounts agree they found the town burning. Apparently the Apalachee had deliberately set it on fire before they themselves retreated. They advance forward, and a few days later they come to the town of Enhica, Apalachee, and there's pretty solid agreement that that is the Governor Martin site where the Bureau of Archaeological Research is located in Tallahassee today, the Myers Park area nearby, excavated by B. Calvin Jones before they spend the winter there and then move on to the north in 1540. So these two groups are already important in the early contact accounts, and one of the detail that's important to note with this is the account of Rodrigo Rangel, one of the most detailed of the DeSoto accounts. He was Soto's secretary. He was one of the soldiers that was part of this advance guard of 150 men. And Rangel refers to Asile, the Timucuan chiefdom, as being, quote, subject to Apalachee. The sense of the Spanish is that there's some kind of political subordination of the people of Asile to the people of Ivitachuco. That's extremely unusual. Normally you have, if you have encounters between any of the Timucuan speakers, especially the Ustega, a little bit further to the east, conflict. But Asile is described as being a subject of Apalachee. Now, you don't hear a lot more from either of these two groups directly. You hear some brief mention of some of the chiefdoms of the Timucua to the west in the accounts of Fort Caroline, of some of the later stuff. But the first time you hear of these two groups again directly is in the early 17th century. After Florida is colonized in 1565, the Spaniards began planting missions. Try first with the Jesuits, don't have a lot of success with the Jesuits, so they move to the Franciscans instead. By the 1580s, you've got Spanish missions up and down the East Coast. You have a rebellion in Guali in the 1580s. The Spaniards overcome that rebellion, reestablish the missions. And as diseases depopulate the peoples, the Timucuan speakers, the Guali on the coast, they concentrate the missions in a few areas, but they're looking to the west to expand. You have one of the Timucuan-speaking chiefs, a young guy who's a teenager, the chief of Patano, that goes to St. Augustine, 1601, renders obedience to the Spanish governor. You have a cluster of missions to the Patano that are founded in the north-central Florida area in the vicinity of Gainesville, northern Marion County. Around about the time these missions are founded, Rochelle Marinon mentioned this yesterday, but briefly speaking, you have two priests. You have Father Martin Prieto and Alonso Serrano that are reaching out because they want to push further west. They want to reach out to Apalachee, and at this point you've got a war going on between the Apalachee and between a number of the western Timucuan-speaking groups, particularly one of the most powerful of the Timucuan chiefdoms, the Ustega, the ones we mentioned just a few minutes ago. They're in the vicinity of modern-day Perry. The account of Father Ore, which describes the expedition by Prieto and Serrano, indicates that there are 70 chiefs. One of the chiefs that's important in negotiating the arrival of the Spaniards in Apalachee is a chief of a town called Cotacochini. That shows up again in later accounts, and Cotacochini appears to be one of the smaller villages or towns that's subject to the chief of Asile. In any case, they facilitate the Spaniards' arrival in Apalachee at the town of Ivitachuco. The chief of Ivitachuco agrees to peace, the Timucuan chiefs agree to peace, and you have a significant delay of several decades, but by the late 1620s for the western Timucua, and then by 1633 for the Apalachee, you have the beginning of missions in this area. One of the missions that was founded was to the Asile, San Miguel de Asile. Seems to have been founded in Timucuan territory. And then on the west side of the river, you have mission San Lorenzo de Ivitachuco that is founded directly to the people of Ivitachuco. You have both of these missions around for a long time. Even despite the intervening rebellions of Apalachee in 1647 and later on the Timucuan Rebellion in 1656, both of these missions stay in the Spanish records. They're still around until the first decade of the 18th century in 1704, when you have the English invasion of this region, English soldiers, militia with Creek allies that basically destroys the missions that are located in this region. Now, for that period of time, the 70, 80 years that these missions were in existence and that Asile and Ivitachuco were both part of the Spanish colonial mission system, Asile continues to be this intermediary between the Timucuan speakers and the Apalachee, and also between the Apalachee, several of the western Timucuan speakers, and the Spanish government. Now, part of the reason that's the case is the relationship that was first mentioned in the Soto expedition accounts 100 years before is still around. You have pretty clear evidence in the Spanish records that Asile is representing in a number of cases the chief of Ivitachuco. You have one interesting thing as a part of the relationship between these two groups. Apalachee territory starts on the west side of the Aucilla. Modern Jefferson County, Leon County, that's where you see the Apalachee in the early contact and colonial periods. But what you wind up with here is the fact that in the early part of the 17th century, we know that a small part of Apalachee land, relatively speaking, it's actually a fair-sized area. Spanish accounts describe it as being 6 leagues running along the river of Ivitachuco, the Aucilla River on the west side. That's about 15 modern miles. But the area where you've got modern-day Lamont, you have the chief of Asile that apparently holds land by gift, by permission of the chief of Ivitachuco. The chief of Asile is anxious to maintain good relations with the Spaniards, so you've got a Spanish governor, Ruy de Salazar, that is anxious to have land of his own. There's already been a Spanish cattle ranch that's been established for the Menendez family over in central Florida, in Patano territory near modern-day Gainesville, the northern side of Paynes Prairie, we believe. So you have here in the 1640s, the chief of Asile gives a substantial chunk of this land that he's holding on the west side of the Aucilla River to Ruy de Salazar to use as one of the early cattle ranches and wheat farms here in this area. The 1651 inventory of the Asile Hacienda describes this land as being, as we said, on the western side of the Aucilla, 6 leagues, which is going to be about 15 or 16 modern miles in length. It's got 5 structures that are listed in the inventory, 2 houses, several barns, and aside from that, a paddock. There's also evidence in the inventory that they have full-time managers living there. You have a guy by the name of Francisco Galindo, who is a mulatto. He is the mayordomo, the manager of the Asile Hacienda. You also have as assistant a guy named Ambrosio. Ambrosio is listed as being a black man of the Angolan nation. These are both enslaved workers to Governor Salazar, but they were apparently trusted because they're here 150, 200 miles from St. Augustine and basically running the hacienda. And during this same period of time, you've got at least a portion of the Apalachee garrison before San Luis is established that is maintained at this wheat farm. You have at least 6 soldiers under the command of a lieutenant at the time that this inventory was taken, and presumably all of them saw action in the 1647 Apalachee Rebellion. Now, based on the historical records of this area and previous limited archaeological study of this area since the 1960s, the Aucilla Research Institute had the opportunity to begin doing a historical site survey beginning in 2019 and continuing intermittently through the present day. The area that we're surveying here, that we're looking at or talking about, is in the vicinity of modern-day Lamont. It's going to be on both the eastern and western sides, hold on just a moment, of the Aucilla River. Here we go. In the area where you see the square on the map here on the right. So the area that we're surveyed is in the extreme eastern part of Jefferson County, here in the central zone of the Aucilla, and in the extreme western part of Madison County. Now, during the course of this survey on the eastern side of the river, one of the sites that was found and that was tested as a part of the survey is a site that's called the Floyd's Mound site, 8MD6. Now, Floyd's Mound was first reported by Charles Fairbanks, but the thing is, Fairbanks never actually came up here to work, at least as far as I can tell. Somebody here locally apparently reported to Fairbanks that all right. Now, what we're looking at here, ladies and gentlemen, are some of the materials that were covered from Floyd's Mound and a view of the mound itself. Fairbanks, as I said, never actually got a chance to test at the site. He just reported that this is an area that was a mound. In 2020, we had the opportunity, by invitation of the current landowner at the time, to go out and to take a look at it and do some initial testing. Now, also had the chance to test at a site that's south of this one that we referred to with great originality as the South Mound site, recorded as 8MD 354. Now, both of these sites were tested, and the intriguing thing to me about the Floyd's Mound site when we first went out there, before we ever put a shovel in the ground, is that it's a platform mound. And you have to understand that is extremely unusual. Timucuan territory, all of the huge area that you've got in the North Florida Peninsula up into southern Georgia, you can count on the fingers of one hand mound sites in Timucuan territory that are actual platform mounds. But this one is a true platform mound. It has 4 sides facing the cardinal direction with a ramp that runs to the east. And you can take a look here at the mound itself down there on the southern end. The South Mound site has a smaller mound, but it's more typical of what you see in Timucuan territory. It's kind of an oblong mound. It's near a wetland. Both sites were found to have an interesting combination of materials. In the uppermost levels of the testing we did at Floyd's Mound, you have Fort Walton ceramics, all right, materials that are normally associated with the historical Apalachee. But that was limited to basically the upper 25 centimeters throughout the site. You see something similar at South Mound, except the number of Fort Walton ceramics there is even smaller. The vast majority of the ceramics that are present at Floyd's Mound and South Mound both are what are called Swanee Valley culture ceramics. Swanee Valley culture is the newest defined of Florida's Native American cultures. John Worth, my committee chair at the University of Florida, when he was working with Brent Wiseman at the Fig Springs site, is the first one to recognize it's a separate archaeological culture. And we didn't have any inkling until we began doing work at this site that the Swanee Valley culture came that far. The nearest Swanee Valley sites before we worked at Floyd's Mound and South Mound that had actually been reported are a minimum of 50 miles or so to the east. And it's intriguing that this site and both sites have this overwhelming majority of the ceramic assemblage as being Swanee Valley culture ceramics. They're covering at the site a very large area north and south of the mound. You take a look at the map that you see right here. This is not the final version of the map that was done, but essentially you're looking at ceramics that run all through the area here, all the way up on this western side. There's a heavy concentration of them here, and you see a very small scatter up here. This area doesn't seem to have been used very much, but these areas you have this dense concentration. So we're looking at a pretty good sized site here. The entire parcel you're looking at here covers more than 40 acres. Around half of that has ceramics, suggesting that we're looking at a pretty good sized town site. Now, we were able to return there under funding from the Florida Division of Historical Resources this past year. And we were able to expand the area that we tested. In the course of testing this year, we found here in this area right up in the northern end of the site, something that kind of changes the complexion of things. We'd found Native American ceramics before, but during the course of the survey here, we found in the western side of the site a fragment of 16th century olive jar, the piece that you see right here, along with some iron fragments that you see right over here. Now, John Worth and I have maintained a relationship longer term, and he and one of his grad students, Carolyn Peacock, and I presented a paper 2 years ago at SHA asking for a revision of Goggins' chronology. Part of the reason for that is that Goggins' middle style olive jar basically was around in the 16th century. The thing is that as a part of that research, I had the opportunity to analyze all of the sherds that were recovered from the Governor Martin site. There's like more than 2,400 of them. But I worked my way through all of them, and in the course of looking at the sherds from Governor Martin, there's no question that that site is associated with DeSoto. It's DeSoto's winter encampment. Found that there are 3 rim types that you can see among the DeSoto sherds. This is type A, type B, and type C. Type C is the one that seems to have evolved into the rims that you see 20 years later at the Luna settlement over in Pensacola. But our sherd from Floyd's Mound is definitely type A. It's got the round shape. It's got the right color to the paste, which is kind of unique compared to other sources of olive jar. So the fact that you've got 16th century ceramics there is a really big marker for the likelihood that this is going to be potentially a Soto site. South Mound has a number of Mission red film sherds that suggest that you've got basically a presence of missionized Native Americans in that same area. Now, on the west side of the river, 8JE 100 is a site that is located about 4 miles west of the Aucilla River in the vicinity of modern-day Lamont. Between that site and the river, about 2.5 miles, there is a cluster of smaller Fort Walton sites that has a larger earthwork in the middle of them, which also appears to be potentially a platform mound or platform mound that's built on top of a larger landform. All of those sites are pure Fort Walton ceramics. You've got essentially what looks like a cluster of Fort Walton sites that runs all the way from this larger site cluster near the earthwork all the way to the river's edge. We've got 2 sites we uncovered during the course of this survey, the Collins Pond South site. So once you get past the river and you're on the western side, all of the evidence says you've got Apalachee control of that territory. And the cluster of sites that's near this earthwork is our best candidate at this point. It is certainly a candidate for the potential site of the early contact site of Ivitachuco. The site that is 3/4 of a mile west of that, which has Mission era ceramics, is a strong candidate and is very likely to be the site of San Lorenzo de Ivitachuco. That's 8JE100. So you've got also a site that Calvin Jones investigated. I don't have a picture of him from that site, so I've got a picture of him working at the Governor Martin site. But in the early 1970s, Calvin Jones investigated sites throughout this area, including one that doesn't have a name as of yet. It's simply referred to by its number, 8J106. Calvin Jones found several structures there. He found an area where there were burials, where there were remains. And he argued that that site represented the site of the Spanish mission town of San Miguel de Asile. Alyssa Slade-Lotane, the current head of the Florida Division of Historical Resources, reanalyzed Jones' collection and essentially argued that no, that is more likely to be the site of San Lorenzo de Ivitachuco. Looking at some of what has been found there, and also looking at other mission sites that I've worked at from the same period of time over in Central Florida and reports of those sites from elsewhere, I would proffer potentially a third hypothesis for additional testing at some point. JE106 is in the area that's nearer the river, and it is in the area the historical records indicate you have the Asile Hacienda. And one thing that struck me, I've talked to Alyssa about this as a part of the assemblage, is that at a Spanish mission site, one big marker that you normally see are beads. They're items that were given to Native Americans by the friars. There are certain specific types that are associated with mission sites in different periods of time. J106 has nothing like that. All of the stuff that's been brought out of the ground there are no beads, there's not the kind of marker. And Calvin Jones, even for his time, was usually pretty good about noting where there were foundations. He specifically noted building foundations he found in other areas of the site. The burials at that site do not appear to be associated with any type of building foundation, and they don't have the orientation that Rochelle Meriden was talking about yesterday that you've seen at other mission sites. You instead see artifacts kind of like the one that you see here, which is one of the ones that has been recovered by one of the local landowners in the vicinity of the site. The axe head here, which Calvin Jones indicated, appeared to be a colonial axe head. I would proffer the hypothesis that 8J106 is an mission site, that the burials there may be related to the 1647 rebellion, but that there is a better chance that J106 is the site of the main houses of the hacienda of Ruy de Salazar. It's going to take a considerable amount of archaeological work in that area to test that hypothesis, but essentially I think that the location, what's been found there, is more likely to bear out that site being a hacienda than that site being a mission site. So essentially, this archaeological work laying out the area that appears to be the town of Asile, the fact that you've got the olive jar, the fact that you've got Swanee Valley culture sites and Fort Walton materials, which is just what you'd expect from the records of the site of Asile, the fact that this cluster of Fort Walton sites on the west fits the historical record and certainly fits the likelihood of the area there being the site of Apalachee Ivitachuco. Where does that leave us based on the data? Now, I would suggest several important conclusions. First things first, the people of Asile and the people of Ivitachuco are right near the Aucilla, both of them. They're within the zone of the river, but they use the resources of the area in markedly different ways. One thing, for example, with Asile and the sites that I believe to be associated with Ivitachuco is the differential use of stone. At Floyd's Mound site, you've got 45% of the total assemblage marked out as lithics. Again, back in the slide up here just a little bit, you can see here on the right side of the Native American artifacts that were recovered from that site, you've got hammerstones, you've got tools, you've got lithic debitage, you see the same thing as South Mound. These people are using lithics on a large scale. On the other hand, you get the Fort Walton sites on the west side of the river, the ones that are pretty much same proximity, should have equal if not greater resources if you assume that Ivitachuco is politically dominant over Asile, that the people of Asile have, but they're not using stone. You have a few flakes, you have a few minor things. You don't see much in the way of Pinellas points or anything from that period of time. If there's stone in the areas there, we know that there is. People of Asile are using it, the people of Ivitachuco are not. Another big difference is the patterning of the site. Floyd's Mound is one large site. South Mound is a smaller site within a certain distance. I've had reported a couple of other areas that look like they're additional Swanee Valley culture sites in that area. That's Timucuan patterning. When I worked out on my doctoral research, the chiefdom of Aquera, when I had the opportunity to work in the territory of the Patano at the Richardson site that appears to be the principal town of Patano, you see the same thing. You see one big site that looks like it's the principal town, and then you see a bunch of other smaller sites nearby at certain distances that appear to be satellite villages or special use sites. That's not what you see on the west side of the Aucilla in the vicinity of Lamont. What you see is something more like when I had the opportunity to first come up here, work with Jim, and later on with Andy at Wakulla, the patterning of the sites you see around Lamont is more like the patterning of the sites that you see at Wakulla Springs. And it's locking up on me again, but essentially there you've got a scattering of smaller sites over a larger area. Radiocarbon dating seems to suggest that those sites are occupied at the same time, so they form one larger occupation. Now, the two cultures, again, they're right close by the same area, they're in the same kind of environment, but you see differential use of space. The patterning on the east side and the patterning on the west side is significantly, obviously different. So if you've got the same environment, you've got the same resources, you've got the same thing that's available to both people, what is it that accounts for these differences? And I think that here you're getting into a fourth area that is important to understand when you're doing any study of archaeology, or for that matter, any study of resources, and that is culture. You wind up with, a lot of times, the assumption, if you work with, for example, the older sites, such as the paleo sites in this area, the focus being on pure resources, the focus being primarily on the hard science that shows the dates, that shows the use of animals, that shows how people were doing things. And I've been astonished throughout this conference. I was astonished when I first came up here and Jim gave me the opportunity to work with ARI to realize just what kind of data you could tease out of the information that you're getting from these underwater sites. And that's only advanced since, as a lot of our speakers have talked about. But the thing is that if you're looking at the same resources, the exact same resources, same period of time and everything, the only thing that really can account for differences in that case is cultural choice. The people of Apalachee, apparently in this period of time, are using space differently than the Timucuan speakers on the other side of the river. And you also have a situation where you have cultural choice affecting use of resources, I would argue, before that. I think if we get to the point where we have more data from paleo sites, particularly as we find out more and more about paleo sites under the water, that there may come a time when we have enough data when we can start to tease out more of the impacts of culture on these very, very ancient people in the way that I think we can see with the later period sites. The people in the historical period, early contact, have a little bit of an advantage. We've got historical documents, we have a larger number of sites, so we're able to tease out more data. But it would not surprise me at all as we proceed with the study of the elements, you know, wind, water, fire, earth, that in the long run, as we get to the older sites, we're going to see the same potential choices and potential cultural impact affect the way that those peoples use their landscape as well. Thank you.